Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it.
Give me one piece of scientific evidence, one example, scientific, observable, testable, repeatable, of life coming from non-life.
And here we are, yet again, back to the god of the gaps, the theist's best friend and bedfellow. We do not know how life originated. Science has not explained the origin of life, but yet he wants atheists to provide evidence of life coming from non-life, otherwise known as abiogenesis. In other words, he wants us to explain the gap in our knowledge. And if we fail to do that, you know what he's going to put in that gap? His God. God of the gaps, guys, the best friend of any Christian apologist.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way. Thank you.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and don't worry, the video is about to begin. I just wanted to take a moment to make you aware of my Patreon, the link for which can be found in the description below. Sign up today for as little as £3 per month and you can gain access to a plethora of perks and extras, including downloadable audio-only and ad-free versions of my podcast that you can listen to on the go. You can also have your question answered in a monthly video, and better still, depending on which tier you choose, you could even sit down for a Skype call with yours truly, Magic Skeptic. All that is available and much, much more. All you got to do is click the link in the description below. I hope to see you there. Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all most welcome to another episode of A Magician's Thoughts. Up for today is a very interesting exploration of a rather novel and some might say bizarre Christian apologist. I'm referring, of course, to Lion, L-I-O-N, Lion of Fire Ministries, who has some of the most unique and interesting arguments against atheists and in favor of God that I've had the pleasure of encountering. So what I've done here, guys, is line up 3 short videos that Lion of Fire Ministries has produced, a very successful YouTube and TikTok channel, I might add. But I've lined up 3 of these just to give you a flavor of this guy's ideas. And let's just say that they'll be good for a bit of a laugh, but we also might get some, meaty ideas that we can chew on and respond to as well. But look, without further introduction and without further ado, let's dive right in and take a look at the first rather novel argument for the existence of God. Have a look.
This is a question for the atheist. Answer this as quickly as possible. How do you spell the word silk? Okay, now answer this as quickly as possible. What do cows drink? No, it's not milk. If you could be wrong about something as simple as this, it's arrogant to think that you couldn't be wrong about God existing.
Unbelievable, right? Absolutely unbelievable. Oh no, I tripped over your word game. Therefore God. Comment below if you actually said milk. Please comment below if you said milk, because now you gotta believe in God, right? This is monumentally stupid. Right, here's my parody argument. For those of you who are listening audio only, you'll just have to listen to the description here, but I'm going to put an optical illusion on screen. Have a look, all right? Believe it or not, dear listener, A and B are the same color. If you don't believe me, pause the video and place your finger over the white line in the middle. A and B are the same color. So all of you theists out there, if you could be wrong, if your eyes could deceive you so easily, if you could be mistaken on something so simple, isn't it arrogant to suggest that your belief in God is definitely true? Couldn't you be mistaken? This is absolutely asinine. This is such a joke. You could be mistaken, therefore God. Wow. Just wow. This argument can be applied to anything, including the inverse of your very own position, you idiots. You could also make that mistake and say milk instead of water, right? This guy's very own argument could be used against him and used against any Christian or any theist more broadly. Anybody could be mistaken about anything, therefore you could be mistaken about God. This really is pathetic, but I got to give this guy an A star. I got to give him an A grade on the creativity here. This really did make me chuckle. But yeah, chuckles aside, this is catastrophically stupid. This is moronic with a capital M. Anyway, let's move on to his next little short, and let's see what you think, dear listener.
The problem with many atheists isn't that they're skeptical. Skepticism is good. It means that we want evidence for the things that we believe. We don't want to believe by blind faith. The problem is that they're cynical, which means that no matter how much evidence they're provided with, they're not going to believe. They're choosing not to believe. This isn't an intellectual thing of the mind, it's a thing of the heart, because they recognise that if they acknowledge the existence of God, then they're accountable to God with how they live their life.
And there you have it. Atheists just want to sin. You got me dead to rights. All I want to do is sin. I want to go out and fornicate. I want to go out and steal. I want to go out and have premarital sex, and I'm, going to get up to all sorts of mischief. Ooh. Oh, God. How many Christians out there really believe this stuff? I mean, it's obviously just a ridiculous assertion. But the other problem here is that his claim is just incoherent. It's not possible for somebody to not believe in something that they've recognized is real, but then they're going to choose not to believe it because they just want to sin.
They're choosing not to believe. This isn't an intellectual thing of the mind, it's a thing of the heart, because they recognise that if they acknowledge the existence of God, then they're accountable to God with how they live their life.
That just makes no sense whatsoever. That's a completely incoherent idea. The problem is that this point of view assumes something called doxastic voluntarism, which is this idea that we can choose our beliefs, which is evidently false. It's not possible to choose what one believes. Becoming convinced of something or becoming unconvinced of something is involuntary, which is why it often feels like an epiphany. It's like a surprise when your mind is changed by some evidence or by something that somebody said. But he seems to be assuming here that atheists are people who recognize that God exists, but choose not to believe in him because they want to do naughty stuff. That assumes doxastic voluntarism, which is a highly controversial philosophical position. But it's not surprising to me that he's making claims that are ridiculous and controversial here, because this guy's probably never even heard of doxastic voluntarism, because he's evidently, and I'm sorry, dear listener, but he's evidently a moron. Now, I'm not engaging in an ad hominem attack here. In other words, I'm not suggesting that he's wrong because he's a moron. What I'm saying is actually the opposite. I'm saying that his argument is so wrong that I've come to the conclusion that he must be a moron as a consequence. In any case, we got one other video lined up here to give you your final flavor of the Fire Ministries, or whatever the hell he's called. What is he called? I've even forgotten the name. I've been so bamboozled. The Lion of Fire Ministries. There you go. One final video to go, folks. Let's dive right in. Brace yourselves.
Atheism is the most silly position that anyone can hold, because you have to believe that nothing created everything and then redefine nothing to mean something.
No, I don't have to believe that. I don't have to believe that nothing created everything. That's a complete straw man, ridiculous point of view. Atheism is a single belief on a single issue. The question is there a God? Atheists say, no, we're not convinced. End of story. Anything beyond that is irrelevant. Anything beyond that has nothing to do with atheism. The origin of reality or lack thereof has nothing to do with atheism. Atheism is a single belief on a single issue. Now, if you want to speak to me as an individual, do I believe that nothing created everything? No, not necessarily. My official position on the question of origins is I don't know. And most atheists I've met say the exact same thing, because scientists don't know. Sure, we know about the Big Bang. We know that the Big Bang happened about 13.8 billion years ago, and there's very good evidence to suggest that that's the case. But we don't know if that's the origin of everything. We may very well be living in an expansion collapse model, where 13.8 billion years ago, the universe collapsed and expanded once again. Maybe in another billion years' time, the universe will collapse and expand once again, and on we go for eternity. Our Big Bang is just a measurement of the latest collapse and expansion cycle. I don't know that that's the case, so please don't put words in my mouth, dear listener. I'm just proposing a potential hypothesis here. The other possibility is that the past is just infinite, right? Maybe our universe was birthed from a parent universe, and our universe is a daughter universe, and this may very well extend for infinity into the past. I don't know. So again, the clear answer is I don't know. And obviously, I'm not duty-bound as an atheist to believe that nothing produced something. I'm not duty-bound to assume that at all. But let's just take that seriously for a moment, because his tone here assumes that that is a ridiculous proposition. Is it, though? Is it ridiculous to assume that nothingness could produce somethingness? Bear with me here for a moment, dear listener, but I think there might be more meat on this bone than the Lion of Fire Ministries assumes. Let's reflect for a moment on why we think that this, generally speaking or intuitively speaking, is a ridiculous notion. It's because our reality, where we are, is governed by the rule of cause and effect. In other words, wherever we see an effect, it is preceded by a cause. Fine. That is a rule that governs our reality. But if indeed there was a point before space and time where there was genuinely nothingness, no space, no time, nothing, wouldn't that also mean that the rule of cause and effect doesn't apply? How could you say that there's nothing there, but the rule of cause and effect still applies? Wouldn't that mean that there was something there, like a rule or a form of rudimentary physics that presupposes cause and effect? If indeed there was a point before space and time where there really was nothingness, and I know that's a contradiction in terms to say there was nothingness, but unfortunately our language fails to adequately describe these rather esoteric concepts, dear listener, so I hope you'll attribute the principle of charity while I run through this explanation. But with the limitation of language acknowledged, if indeed there was a point where there was no space and no time, why would the rule of cause and effect apply? Maybe if there genuinely is nothingness, if there is nothing, no space, no time, no cause and effect, nothing, then maybe it's possible for something to pop into existence out of nothing. Why would it be impossible? The only way you could say it's impossible is if you're basing the rules of that nothingness on our reality where cause and effect applies. But isn't that obscene? Isn't that a ridiculous comparison? Why would you compare the rules of a reality governed by cause and effect? Why would you compare that with a state of nothingness where there's no space or time? Isn't that a pretty darn ridiculous comparison? Isn't that inappropriate at the very least? Isn't it a mistake to draw lessons from space and time about how nothingness would function? Isn't that an egregious mistake in terms of comparisons? Well, I submit the question to you, dear listener, and I mean that question sincerely. I think there's a genuinely interesting philosophical question there. You want to know my opinion? I think it's ridiculous to compare our space and time with a state of nothingness and to expect that state of nothingness to cohere to our rules of cause and effect. So the next time a theist says to you that it's obscene to suggest that somethingness can come from nothingness, remind them of the absurdity of comparing our space-time with a reality where there is no space and time, where there is nothing and henceforth there is no cause and effect.
But you might say, I'm an atheist and I don't believe that. Well, you have to believe that out of necessity if you hold to the position. There's no alternative.
But there are alternatives, Lion of Fire Ministries. There are. Perhaps you're ignorant about them, but just because you're not aware of them doesn't mean that there aren't alternatives. As I've already said, it's entirely possible that the past is infinite. There are physicists, many of whom take that possibility very seriously. That is an alternative. You are erecting a false dichotomy here. Line of Fire Ministries wants us to assume that there are only two possible options. Either God did it, or nothing produced everything. But that is a false dichotomy. The other possibility that's on the table here is that there was just always something. And in fact, his very own logic assumes this. If indeed it's impossible for something to come from nothing, well then that means there must have always been something. I'll say that again. If it's impossible for something to come from nothing, then there must always have been something. Because if it's impossible for something to come from nothing and there was at one point nothing, then we shouldn't be here. Because it's impossible for something to come from nothing. But the very fact that we are here, having this conversation, having this dialogue, thinking about this philosophically, means that there is something. And if it's impossible for something to come from nothing and we find ourselves in a state of somethingness, that means there cannot have been a point in the past where there was nothing, which would mean that the past is infinite. Now, am I saying I know that, dear listener? Am I asserting that as a fact? No, I'm merely pointing out that Line of Fire Ministries has erected a false dichotomy, which is to say a false choice. A false dichotomy is when somebody presents two options as though they are exhaustive, when in fact there are more options. And all I need do is point out at least one additional option to prove that the dichotomy is false. And the additional option I've pointed out is that a past infinite is possible. If indeed the past is infinite, we don't have to have something coming from nothing, and we don't require a creator God. It's just a case that there was always something. So your dichotomy is debunked. As an atheist, I don't have to accept that something came from nothing. I don't have to accept your God. I can also entertain the possibility that there was always something, aka the past is infinite. But there is one other option, and it is the most humble option, and it is the option I adopt as an atheist. And that is the option whereby one throws up their hands and says, you know what? I don't know. I'm going to wait until the data is in, because we're talking about something about which neither of us knows very much about. We're talking about something that there's no scientific consensus on. I'm happy to wait until there's evidence. And I'm happy to say until then that I do not know. And that's the difference between people like me and Line of Fire Ministries. Of course, he's a theist, so he's going to say he knows things that nobody really knows, including questions of origins. Anyway, let's move on and finish his little video here and see what he has to say in closing.
Give me one piece of scientific evidence, one example, scientific, observable, testable, repeatable, of something coming from nothing, or of life coming from non-life, or of the rational coming from the irrational, chaos, or intelligent information not coming from an intelligent mind. I'll give you a clue. There is no example. It's not possible. Because atheism is a fairy tale for adults, because not even children are silly enough to believe it.
This just gets more and more ridiculous as the video goes on, so thankfully we're near the end here, dear listener. But because he saddled atheists with this idea that they must believe that the universe came from nothing, that something came from nothing.
Atheism is the most silly position that anyone can hold, because you have to believe that nothing created everything.
He now wants evidence of something coming from nothing, which of course no atheist or nobody can possibly offer. But as I've already pointed out, atheists are not duty-bound to accept this claim that something came from nothing. Atheism as a single belief on a single issue is the regard atheists say we're not convinced. Origins is a completely separate matter altogether, but his assertion is that atheists must believe that something came from nothing. And if you're going to believe that, you'd have to provide evidence, testable, repeatable, and all the rest of it, of something coming from nothing. And of course, no atheist can do that, so therefore, atheists are irrational, atheists are morons, atheists are ridiculous, yada, yada, yada. But you will not meet atheists who believe that something came from nothing. You won't meet them. And if you do, I mean, I'd be shocked, personally speaking, but I would agree with you that that atheist believes something that they cannot epistemologically justify. Fair enough. But that's not me, and it's not any atheist I've ever met. Atheists don't go around believing that the universe came from nothing or that something can come from nothing. As I've said in this video, it's not necessarily impossible for something to come from nothing. I think that there's a possibility there. I'm not saying that it's happened. I'm saying that it is inappropriate to infer things about a state of nothingness based on a state of somethingness. That's all I've said. But yeah, I'm not going to give you an example of something coming from nothing. I can't do that, but I'm not claiming that the universe came from nothing. So this thing that he saddled the atheist with is just ridiculous. So let's move on to his second challenge.
Give me one piece of scientific evidence, one example, scientific, observable, testable, repeatable, of life coming from non-life.
So the second thing he wants is for atheists to give an example of life coming from non-life. And here we are yet again, back to the god of the gaps, the theist's best friend and bedfellow. We do not know how life originated. Science has not explained the origin of life. It is a mystery. And so when you ask atheists how life began, they'll say, I don't know. But yet he wants atheists to provide evidence of life coming from non-life, otherwise known as abiogenesis. In other words, he wants us to explain the gap in our knowledge. And if we fail to do that, you know what he's going to put in that gap? His God. God of the gaps, guys, the best friend of any Christian apologist. Explain this gap. Oh, well, I can't do that. See, God. This is appalling. It is a textbook argument from ignorance. What he's done is lay down a challenge. Atheists, explain how life came from non-life. Can't do it, therefore God. It's a textbook argument from ignorance because what he's saying is, if you can't explain this gap, my explanation must be correct. If you can't explain this mystery, therefore God. That is a textbook argument from ignorance fallacy. Please notice that the atheist's inability to explain that gap, the atheist's inability to explain how life came from non-life, does not serve as evidence for his assertion that God is the best explanation. He still has to provide independent evidence for the existence of his God and God's causal role in the origin of life. But he hasn't done that. Instead, he's challenging atheists to explain where life comes from and then declaring victory by default when they throw up their hands with honest humility and admit that they can't do it. It would be lovely, line of Fire Ministries, if you could just show a modicum of that humility that atheists show on a daily basis when they hold up their hands and say, listen, like I'm about to say, I can't explain where life came from. Science hasn't answered that question yet. I'm happy to say that I don't know how it happened. Do you know? And of course, he will assert that God explains that gap. The God of the gaps, folks, the theist's best friend. But let's listen to the next challenge he lays at atheists' feet.
Give me one piece of scientific evidence, one example, scientific, observable, testable, repeatable, of the rational coming from the irrational, chaos.
And the God of the gaps argument rears its ugly head once again. Now he's talking about rationality. In other words, he's talking about consciousness, another gap in our knowledge. We do not know where consciousness comes from. It's called the hard problem of consciousness for a reason. So he's challenging atheists to explain how consciousness emerged, and if we fail to do so, therefore God. Guys, this is spectacularly weak. This is the most obvious example of God of the Gap's reasoning ever. And he has no idea that he's doing this. Look at him there with his smugness and his arrogance and his certitude. Atheists can't explain science's greatest mysteries. Therefore, God must be the compelling or the most compelling explanation. This is completely facile and asinine. I'm very happy to admit that I can't explain consciousness. I don't know how rationality emerged. I don't know how consciousness emerged. I don't know how self-awareness emerged. The hard problem of consciousness is a very difficult chestnut to crack. Maybe we'll never answer it. I don't know. But so long as it remains a mystery, it is just that, a mystery. Mysteries do not serve as evidence for your chosen deity. I'm sorry, that is absolutely ridiculous. God of the gaps, guys, as I've said before and I'll say it again, the best friend of any Christian apologist. And you can see it out on force in this video.
I'll give you a clue. There is no example. It's not possible. Because atheism is a fairy tale for adults, because not even children are silly enough to believe it.
And he concludes with another fallacy, the black swan fallacy. He alleges that because there is no example, therefore it is impossible.
There is no example. It's not possible.
In other words, because we haven't observed it yet, therefore it cannot be. If you've never seen a black swan, it doesn't mean that there are no black swans. That is what the black swan fallacy is. It's the fallacy of assuming that there are no black swans because you haven't seen one. And in the exact same way, he's saying that because we've never seen life come from non-life, that therefore it's impossible. Because we've never seen consciousness emerge from unconsciousness, therefore it's impossible. These are fallacies. They are black swan fallacies. Just because something has been hitherto unobserved does not mean that that thing is impossible. Now, it doesn't mean that it is possible. I'm not saying the opposite here. I'm just pointing out that him saying that because there's no example of something, that therefore it doesn't exist, that is a fallacy, folks. It's a black swan fallacy. Having not seen something does not mean that that's impossible. And I include God in that, by the way. I'm not going to commit that same black swan fallacy that Line of Fire Ministries is committing here. I'm not going to say that because I have never seen a God, that therefore no God exists. My position is that I'm unconvinced in the existence of gods because nobody has presented any evidence for them. That doesn't mean that I'm claiming there is no God. It doesn't mean that I'm making the positive claim that no gods exist. All I'm saying is, I'm unconvinced. I do not currently believe in a God because nobody has presented evidence for one. That is very distinct from claiming with certainty that there are no gods. If you're confused about that distinction, dear listener, reflect on the analogy of the difference between not guilty and innocent. If you reflect on the difference between those two things, it's directly analogous to me saying I'm unconvinced in the existence of God as opposed to claiming with certainty that there are no gods. In short, I find God not guilty of existing, which is to say that there's not enough evidence to convict God of existence. It does not mean that I find God innocent of existence, which would be to say that there definitely is no God. The mere fact that we haven't observed these things thus far does not constitute evidence for their impossibility. That is the black swan fallacy. If he wants us to take seriously his claim that, for example, life cannot come from non-life, he would have to prove that. But he hasn't proved that. He has merely asserted that. And he has coupled that assertion with a black swan fallacy, whereby he assumes that because it has been hitherto unobserved, that therefore it is impossible. This is fallacious in the extreme. Now, am I saying the opposite? No. My official answer on all of those unanswered questions is, I don't know. That's the only honest answer. But again, that is the difference between someone like me and Line of Fire Ministries. I'm happy to hold up my hands and admit that I don't know things. I'm happy to hold up my hands and admit that there are limits to my knowledge and that there are things that are as of yet unexplained. But of course, a gap in our knowledge is an enormous opportunity for a Christian apologist like Line of Fire Ministries, who inserts God in every single gap he can find, including the gap about the origin of life and the gap about the origin of consciousness. These things are as of yet unexplained, and of course, Line of Fire Ministries is going to exploit these gaps in our knowledge, but he's not going to get away with it so long as there are atheists like me who are going to expose this fallacious reasoning. So long as I'm around, assertions built on fallacies, built on assertions, are not going to cut it. I'm going to challenge this wherever and whenever I see it. And Line of Fire Ministries is one of the most obvious examples of fallacious and assertive reasoning that I've encountered in recent memory. I don't think there was 10 seconds in the entire video where he didn't utter some falsehood, or utter an assertion, or utter a fallacy, or all three combined.
Atheism is the most silly position that anyone can hold. It's arrogant to think that you couldn't be wrong about God existing, because you have to believe that nothing created everything and then redefine nothing to mean something. No matter how much evidence they're provided with, they're not going to believe. They're choosing not to believe. This isn't an intellectual thing of the mind. There is no example. It's not possible. The problem is that they're cynical. Atheism is a fairy tale for adults because not even children are silly enough to believe it.
This is absolutely appalling. And of course, he concludes with an insult, that atheism is such a fairy tale and that it's so foolish that not even a child will accept it. Well, that may or may not be true. Maybe children accept atheism, maybe they don't. But all I can tell you is that it's utterly irrelevant. What matters is your reasoning. And Line of Fire Ministries is severely lacking in the reasoning compartment. What we've gotten is assertions and fallacies and assertions and fallacies all wrapped up in a neat bow for you to digest, dear listener. Well, did you enjoy the meal? Was it satisfactory? Was it reasonable? Did it stand up to scrutiny? I think not. And on that note, guys, I'm going to leave it there. What did you think of my criticism? Jump into the comments below if you agreed with my critique, or if you thought I could have done better. Please leave some constructive criticism. I always welcome that. I'm always trying to improve. Maybe you're a Christian and you disagree with me fundamentally. Again, jump into the comments below and let me know where I went wrong. I want to be corrected. I have the goal, as Matt Dillahunty often points out, of believing as many true things and as few false things as possible. And if you can help enlighten me, I welcome it. Other than that, guys, please do drop a like on the video. It costs you nothing and it helps out the channel enormously. And in closing, I want to extend an extra special thank you to my patrons. You guys are amazing. Your continued generosity completely blows me away. If you'd like to become a patron like those I've mentioned, jump into the description box below and you'll find the link to my Patreon page, where you can sign up for as little as £3 a month. And for that, you'll gain access to a plethora of perks, bonuses, and extras. With all that out of the way, guys, thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. All the best. Bye-bye.